Developed by Monolith Productions and published by Sierra Entertainment and Warner Bros. Games, F.E.A.R breached the market in 2005 to much critical acclaim, widespread praise, and many a busted nut. And as is the industry norm, where there is success, there are sequels. However, the matter here wasn't as cut and dry as one might think. At the time, the F.E.A.R IP was in the hands of Sierra, and Monolith had just been acquired by Warner Bros. In 2004, making things complicated for a follow-up. And so, prior to Monolith's and Warner Bros. Reclamation of the IP that would allow them to produce a sequel in an official capacity, Sierra had other plans for it. With development having been outsourced to Timegate Studios, a standalone expansion to F.E.A.R was released in 2006. A relatively new studio at the time, much like Monolith, no one quite knew what to expect of Timegate. But the one thing no one saw coming was an expansion that wouldn't just match, but go on to outdo the game it was iterating on. Let's talk about Extraction Point. As an expansion, remarkably unlike the short-lived DLC of today, Extraction Point serves up a decent-sized portion of content by way of a campaign roughly half as long as the base game. And for a piece of additional content, it manages to stand out further by surpassing the base game in every manner conceivable. Presentation, gameplay, testosterone, and all. The story kicks off roughly 10 seconds after the latter and sees you making your way to an extraction point after yet another innocent Black Hawk meets its untimely demise in typical F.E.A.R fashion. Right off the bat, one thing is evident. The environments are far more varied and detailed this time around. The base game was primarily carried by its lighting and the dynamic nature of the particle effects during gunfights. Beyond that, the levels themselves could be charitably described as a bunch of desaturated, almost monochromatic cuboids that were composed in the office spaces, labs, and warehouses. Not so here. Within the first 20 minutes, you've been through a chopper crash, into a flaming, decrepit apartment complex, out onto the streets, and into a replica-infested church, venturing in and out of its claustrophobic, catacomb-like underbelly, after which you exit to the industrial sector. For as fantastical as fighting off troops in an Area 51-style base might be, in all its beige glory, there's nothing quite as grounded as doing the same in a familiar urban setting, and a variety of them at that. Better still, the transition between areas seldom feels forced. F.E.A.R frequently toys with the twisting of perception and reality after all, leading to these disparate environments flowing together surprisingly organically. But Timegate didn't just stop at the aesthetics. The arena layouts were completely revamped, increasing their complexity in a manner that elevates firefights to a whole new level. When I talked about how levels were designed around the AI in my previous video dissecting the entirety of F.E.A.R, I mentioned how it was extremely simplistic, so as to avoid scenarios where the AI behaved unnaturally, and to make the levels easy to visually parse for the player. Replaying and analyzing Extraction Point has led me to reevaluate my perspective. Combat arenas in F.E.A.R, the base game, are primarily planar. There is very little verticality at play, and they're fairly simplistic at that, with only a handful of chest-high barriers and columns acting as cover in otherwise empty corridors and open rooms. The firefights in Extraction Point, on the other hand, are orchestrated in one of two types of arenas. The first is the planar kind, quite similar to its counterpart in the base game, but with far more diversity in terms of cover and dynamic objects like glass pane, smart objects, and physics objects. The second involves an element of verticality, wherein the horizontal levels that comprise it are fairly simple themselves, but additional depth is introduced by way of multiple new angles to stay wary of. I'd be lying if I said the base game lacked the latter, but it hardly felt fair to count them as a separate category on their own when there are just 3 or so instances of it that come to mind, and very limited ones at that. The AI as a whole is noticeably more aggressive and is more willing to flank and push you out of cover. This plays well with the overall changes made to the layout of arenas, however, it isn't particularly helped by any of the new weapons or enemies, since your standard arsenal more than suffices. In summation, the levels are far more varied, both from a visual and ludic standpoint, and thus comprise a far sturdier backbone with which to carry the combat experience. This much is made evident during a sequence that encapsulates the quintessential F.E.A.R combat experience in a single gunfight, one I presume may very well be the most memorable one in the franchise. However, perhaps in an effort to really prove themselves with this outing, Timegate didn't just stop at improving the base game's strong points, they also chose to work on its Achilles heel, the horror. For all its jump scares and pattern breaking, while the base game was able to ramp up tension by incorporating unpredictability, that tension isn't to be misconstrued with fear. As fear, the emotion, Christ, this fucking... The best horror is psychological, the kind that preys on you by turning your mind into your own worst enemy, causing you to dream up your own nightmares and question whether the lens you view the world through has been corrupted. Alma Wade, derivative of contemporary Japanese horror tropes, carried the image of an innocent child that had been innately corrupted. This is the foundation on which all such spooky children are built on, and F.E.A.R did just that. And it sort of stopped exploring the idea right after. It continued to add flavor text to her background via audio logs and dialogue, but it never really bothered exploring Alma's abilities beyond the unreliable dream state that the Point Man dips in and out of while subjected to hallucinations. The horror in Extraction Point, on the other hand, stems from an area that Monolith would eventually go on to explore, but hadn't yet managed to do so, or perhaps hadn't even bothered to begin with. The idea that Alma wasn't manufacturing these horrors herself, but rather was a functioning conduit for paranormal forces far beyond our human sensibilities. Forces that have always existed alongside us, but have only just now found a way to directly interact with us. And this idea is made manifest via the Shades, a paranormal counterpart to the replica assassins. They spend the first half of the expansion ignoring you in favor of a larger threat, the replica. You only manage to catch brief glimpses of them as they phase in and out of reality, grateful that they don't seem to acknowledge your presence. Extraction Point also throws Delta Force Sergeant Holiday into the fray alongside you, introducing companion AI into the campaign for the first time, and by God is it empowering knowing that you're not operating alone. It builds up a sense of camaraderie between you, fueled by his lighthearted demeanor.
This just keeps getting better and better. We'll just meet up on the other side. Again.
You fight alongside each other as you make your way through the warehouse district, fighting your way through a number of open spaces that don't pose too much of an issue since, well, there's someone giving you a hand this time. And as your rappo begins to reach its crescendo, the horror comes knocking.
Careful. I've got a bad feeling about this. He did this to himself. I'm not exactly burning with curiosity about what's on the other side, are you? Man, this is not right. Not good. Fine, Jin.
Bravo, Timegate. You've painted a pretty picture of the Shades and managed to pull off the only meaningful death so far in one fell swoop. A high of confidence followed by an emotional gut punch. That's a twofer right there. Extraction Point also further adds some depth to Alma by digging a bit deeper into the contrast between her child and teenage selves. The younger seems to want to help the Point Man, her eldest child, beckoning him over to help aid him in his mission, while her older self is completely enveloped in a frantic rage that wants to lash out at everything that isn't helping her get even with Armacam. It's a bit unjust and unquestionably extreme, but then that's what her older self stands for. The tail end of the expansion sees these two halves unite at some ball of light that's first introduced during an otherworldly sequence at the very beginning. Whether this means her past is reconciled with her present and why the light was attracting so many shades are questions that are beyond me. I don't see enough here to come to a meaningful conclusion beyond it alluding to some semblance of structure to her madness. Regardless, despite the lackluster narrative of the expansion, it certainly manages to deliver far more than the base game did on its horror front. That much is unmistakable. Stepping back and viewing it as a whole, Extraction Point is nevertheless a staggering improvement on the original's formula, with its only folly being the story, which admittedly only existed to provide context to begin with, so it isn't exactly an outright loss. It's easy to see how its 4-hour campaign managed to win Expansion of the Year, and it's just as easy to point out why Perseus Mandate didn't.
I don't know what the fuck is going on.
Perseus Mandate is an expansion made first and foremost for reasons that anyone over the age of 6 can relate to. Fun bucks. This much becomes evident as what starts out as a passable expansion gradually devolves over the course of its runtime into a tedious chore, complete with bland, unflattering levels and bullet sponge enemies. Despite the fact that you do still traverse through a larger variety of environments compared to the base game, which isn't exactly much of an accomplishment, that alone doesn't remedy the fact that the environments themselves are painfully lackluster. Repetitive, uninspired corridors gradually blend into invariant, mind-numbingly dull sectors that seem to go on for far longer than they have any right to. It leads to the entire campaign feeling 2 hours longer than it needs to be. The flavorless environments combined with the simplified arenas are hardly appreciable given what the same team managed to deliver just one expansion before.
What's that?
Further adding to the dichotomy between the two, neither of Perseus Mandate's companion characters, a stereotypical jarhead hardass and the other a stereotypical funny guy, can hold a candle to Holiday's self-awareness and dry wit. The two of them assist the player character. A sergeant that can use reflex mode because the three of you comprise a secondary F.E.A.R cell hitherto unmentioned in the story that proceeds to retread their way through a smattering of levels, about a third of which you've already been through, another third of which you feel like you've been through, and the caves, which ranks just below white noise on the list of things I could fall asleep to, and just above waiting for my sub count to increase by 1. I implore you to like and subscribe because it only feels appropriate to force it in here. The combat most certainly isn't helped by the simplified arenas and is further let down by the new hostile faction, the Nightcrawler mercs, who for all the coolness factor that they bring to the table, are essentially just slightly beefier versions of the replica. The single worst enemies of the bunch are the Nightcrawler elites, human-shaped tanks that are likely equipped with the first prototype of Crisis nanosuits. Alongside this, they canonically possess reflex mode as well, enabling them to dodge most of your shots because the love child of these two contextually horrible changes is an enemy that is most effectively dealt with by stacking proximity mines and remote bombs or spending a good 15 seconds or so engaging them in reflex mode. Methods that run counter to the most enjoyable aspects of F.E.A.R's dynamic on-the-move combat. The simplified arena layouts, the tank-like nature of the enemies, and the over-reliance on reflex mode result in what feels like a compromise to make the game more accommodating for those playing it on a console. Since while consoles were previously an afterthought, Perseus Mandate was developed from the get-go with them in mind. The new weapon certainly seemed designed in accordance with this. The VES is an assault rifle with less recoil, tighter spread, a scope, and far more ammo for it compared to the regular rifle, since the latter is now entirely obsolete. The lightning gun is an improved laser cannon that only requires you to aim in the general vicinity of your target, and the grenade launcher is complete dogshit unless the nades make contact with an enemy, whereupon they explode instantly. If not, they just faff about uselessly on the ground while the intended target walks away unharmed. It seems to be solely intended for use against heavy units rather than infantry, and does make for easy pickings against them. Speaking of things that got worse, a tangent that I could use to start discussing just about anything else in this expansion, the horror is far less subtle and more aggressively presented, in a manner that almost borderlines on parody in the context of the cliched narrative. You hear spooky sounds and turn the corner to find blood on a body, because of course you would. The man spearheading the Nightcrawler operation that turns out to have been a disposable asset all along turns his back on them to help you out, and is promptly crushed by a van for daring to do so. Even in spite of itself, the narrative still manages to have its moments via carefully orchestrated set pieces. It builds on a layer of political intrigue regarding the involvement of external parties behind the scenes. You partake in an all-out assault on Armacam's archival facility alongside Delta Force Marines. The section where all the dormant replica troops that fill an industrial complex are reactivated while you're away for just a few minutes is thrilling to say the least. Another sees you entrapped, awaiting your imminent death as a Rev 8 unit Kool-Aids its way into the hall, leading to a frantic chase as you do your damnedest to avoid it, until you notice all the ordnance laying around the place and realize that this is where you make your stand. And all of these fantastic scenarios are functionally encapsulated by the final minutes of the expansion. a wave-based clash against the Nightcrawler commander that has a fantastic build-up, raising the tension as you prepare for a firefight against the toughest human enemy in the series so far. And the payoff is let down by the poor layout of the arena, and it's followed by a lengthy gunfight in a wide open area that requires you to spend most of your time in cover. Despite all the tension building, despite the stakes being raised, despite everything, these moments crumble into dust under the weight of the horrendous level layouts and combat. These flaws are fundamentally pervasive, ruining moments that would otherwise have been able to single-handedly carry Perseus Mandate out of the hole it dug itself into. The expansion's critical reception was further tarnished by virtue of the fact that it felt decidedly last generation in its visuals, stacked next to other full-fledged games that released alongside it, like Modern Warfare, BioShock, and Crysis. A burden Extraction Point didn't have to carry. That its environment design was as insipid as it was did nothing to help its case. 1. A surprising success showered with praise and adoration for iteratively improving on a proven concept. The other, doomed to failure by both its contemporaries and its creators. 2 expansions that managed to find their place on sides of the same coin, with divergent ethos governing them. Iteration versus stagnation. Refinement versus complacency. Passion versus business.
In the control booth there, would you run the tape?
As always, for the 10 or so of you that watch my videos all the way to the end, it really does mean a lot. You may have noticed that this video is quite a bit shorter than usual. I have an absolutely massive list of games I'd love to talk about, and I simply can't bring myself to do half-hour-long critiques on each of them. So high-level overviews like this one and low-level design dives into specific aspects that I find intriguing, like the Mirror's Edge and Megaton Rainfall videos, will comprise the vast majority of what you can expect to see from me going forth. As such, it's time for me to move forth with the Monolith timeline and start digging my way through F.E.A.R 2 and 3. See you on the other side.